Welcome to our panel discussion, The Working Life in Texas. I'm Dr. Michael Phillips. I've been a professor of history at Collin College since 2007. I started doing these yearly conversations with labor leaders 7 years ago because I wanted to make sure that a conference on working class studies includes the voices of the working class. I've been part of labor organizations myself. As a graduate student at the University of Texas, I signed up with the Communication Workers of America, and I'm now a proud member of the Texas Faculty Association. This has become one of my favorite things I do each year. This panel gives me the chance to talk to some of the bravest and strongest people I've ever met. Since the origins of the labor movement in America, organizing workers so they can fight for workplace dignity and safety, living wages, and a voice has always carried substantial risk, economically and sometimes physically. We're holding this panel virtually, of course, because of a pandemic that has killed in less than a year almost as many Americans as who died in 4 years of World War II. COVID is a particularly cruel disease, sentencing people to die alone without their loved ones nearby. But it's been a particularly and relentlessly merciless disease towards the poor and the working class. COVID has really thrown into stark contrast and stark relief our healthcare disparities, our income inequalities, and has placed millions of frontline workers, healthcare providers, first responders, educators, mail carriers, pilots, airline employees, those who toil at slaughterhouses, those employed at restaurants, fast food places, grocery stores, and people who work at delivery services in potentially deadly working conditions, and has forced those workers to make a choice between their lives and health and their employment at a time of sky-high joblessness. So many workers have died this year. And I want to note that we lost one of our own colleagues at Collin College, a nursing professor named Iris Mehta, who at 70 came out of retirement to teach because she wanted to help the community during the pandemic. I would like at this time to observe a moment of silence for her and for all the good working people who have died during this nightmare. This pandemic has had other terrible effects. Unemployment last April peaked at 14.8%. That is the highest point since statistics were being kept in 1946 for the first time, and it's thought to be the highest since the Great Depression. Unemployment in the leisure and hospitality industry hit a staggering 39.3% that same month. The overall unemployment rate still stands at about 6.7%, and some employers took advantage of the desperate job market to crush workers' struggles for decent treatment. Instacart, a grocery delivery company that defines most of its workforce as independent contractors, had a small number of employees it categorized, number of its workers it categorized as employees. However, when 10 workers in Illinois voted to unionize, the company fired them and eliminated 1,900 other jobs. That erased workplace protections for almost its entire workforce. Uber and Lyft spent $200 million on Proposition 22, a little-known referendum placed on the California ballot and approved by that state's voters. This new law excludes gig workers like delivery service drivers of typical worker benefits like health, unemployment and accident and insurance and paid sick leave. Meanwhile, amidst all this misery, times have never been better for America's 614 billionaires, whose wealth since March has grown by 931 billion. Almost 10 million Americans face the serious prospect of homelessness. At the same time, Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon.com, saw his wealth grow by 70 billion. Meanwhile, he's carrying out an aggressive anti-unionization drive, even while his workforce has never been under greater stress. These are the realities faced by American workers at the beginning of a new decade. But in spite of this, workers continue to be resilient and strong. And today we're going to meet some of those workers. So we're going to switch to the panel view, if we can, the group view. And I want to introduce some of our panelists today. And when I'm done with the introductions, we'll switch back to speaker view. Stacy Gray is a single mom and a musician living in Austin, Texas. She has worked on and off at Book People, Texas's largest bookstore. Sorry, let me repeat that. She works at Book People, Texas's largest independent bookstore, since she moved to Austin in 1998. In July 2018, she helped start a campaign to unionize the employees of Book People, and on January 24th of this year, those employees basically at that bargaining unit unanimously voted to ratify their first collective bargaining agreement. Stephanie Kopnag was born in Cameroon. She works for American Airlines. She's an activist at Unite Here, an airline caterers union that before the COVID-19 pandemic fought against low wages that made it impossible for workers like her to pay rent and other necessities without working overtime. She has helped lead protests over working conditions at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in 2019. Pauline Mims hails from Buffalo, New York. For 21 years, she's been a member of the United Auto Workers and has served as a Region 5 Women's Council second vice president. She is also the president and co-founder of the Grand Prairie Arlington chapter for the Coalition of Labor Union Women. Chad Pearson teaches history at Collin College, a community college in Plano, Texas. He is the author of Reform or Repression, Organizing America's Anti-Union Movement, and is co-editor with Rosemary Foyer of Against Labor, How U.S. Employers Organize to Defeat Union Activism. He is currently writing a book about different types of employer violence, which he wants to call Capitalist Terrorist, Anti-Labor Violence in the Long 19th Century. From 2002 to 2008, he served as a business agent and organizer with the Communication Workers of America Local 1104. Steve Ruiz is involved in almost everything involving labor in Tarrant County and the whole region. He's a member of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 20, a member of the AFL-CIO Central Labor Legislative Council Committee. He helped organize support for GM workers during their strike. Sarah Swallow joined the labor movement in 2016 as a volunteer for the Fight for 15 in Austin, Texas. Over the next 3 years, she had leadership roles in that campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, Austin's Paid Sick Leave or Sick Days Campaign, Young Active Labor Leaders, Texas State Employees Union, and the Democratic Socialists of America, and she is now a legislative aide for the Texas State Employees Union. Tavita Uhatafi is a member of the Tarrant County Labor Council Executive Board and Transportation Workers of America, as well as the AFL-CIO, and a leader of the Asian American Alliance Local. And finally, Leah Waters is a multi-platform editor for the Dallas Morning News and was elected as the Dallas News Guild Unit Chair last fall, after 75% of the newsroom voted to unionize in October. And by the way, that's really historic for newspapers in Texas. Waters, along with the 18-member Guild Bargaining Committee, is currently negotiating its first contract with Dallas Morning News owner A.H. Belo. Now, my introduction includes some grim information, but I wanted to start our discussion with a couple of success stories. Two of our panelists, as I've noted, have recently led successful unionization drives. So I want to open with Leah, if we can switch to speaker view and focus on Leah here. As I just mentioned, a newspaper guild recently formed at the Dallas Morning News, and almost at exactly the same time, a guild formed at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. So I have three questions for you, and if I need to remind you of one of these, let me know. First, I'm curious how COVID has affected journalism and the newspaper industry, and affected the job situation for journalists. Secondly, forming a guild is always a radical change at any workplace. I was wondering what challenges you faced organizing a union at what has always been a really conservative organization, the Dallas Morning News. Third, what were the working conditions specifically at your newspaper that prompted a need for the guild, and are those conditions typical in your industry?
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Can everyone hear me? Okay. First of all, I don't know how I drew this short straw to go first. That was a really great introduction. And let me just say, I normally hate meetings. I hate Zoom calls. I want to be working, doing my job, whatever. But y'all are my people. Like, you're my people. So this is really great, like having labor people and people who believe in like caring for humans with, decent rights, that kind of thing. It's like really exciting to talk about. So I'm so glad I could be here. I did try to come up with some answers. I've actually been thinking about these kind of things a lot, about how COVID has impacted journalism. You know, let me just say a couple of things about that. We were already sort of burnt out from doing this job for not enough pay, not enough hours, right? So there's already that. And then like turnover was always constant because the wages were so low. There's always a bigger opportunity somewhere else in a place like Washington Post or New York Times that is experiencing dramatic growth. And so there's that. So there's also journalists were also facing their own health struggles during COVID and covering a crisis like this, and not just physical, but also mental. Like the toll it takes to talk to victims' families and report their stories it's a horrible burden that a lot of people have to take. And that's been really hard to do that. I haven't had to do it as much as some of my other colleagues because I work on the platform desk. So that's been really challenging. One other thing too, fighting misinformation from every side, constantly have to justify, well, you see here, I'm just repeating what this person said. I'm not fake, I swear. Like, this is what they said, you can go check. So that's also complicated things and made it really hard because, the journalism industry is partly to blame, mostly to blame, for losing the public's trust throughout decades and decades of abusing it. So I think that like we do have to regain the public's trust, and we have been. It's just, it's a big mess with all that right now. On top of that, because of what was predicted to be an economic downturn as a result of the pandemic last spring, our company cut pay across the board for all workers. And during the pandemic, during a really stressful time, but not ours, right? And this was before we unionized. So they cut that in April. We unionized in October. So it was really stressful. We were working to unionize, but we hadn't done it yet. So that was really challenging. So reporters today are facing a lot, not to mention the reckoning of racial injustice in America right now, covering that, also seeing it in their newsrooms. And there's a lot. But here's a surprising thing. Subscriptions at our publication have gone up since March. We had a huge spike in March, right? And so as workers, you're like, well, we're the content, right? They're reading us. This is the work we're producing. And yet our pay was cut and your hours are increased and you can't complain. You have to work overtime and like all the things that go with it. So it's been a really hard year. And on top of that, we were organizing. And so it's been a hard year for us. I can't necessarily say like journalism as a whole, but it's been a hard year doing our jobs in general. I'm sure you all can attest to that yourselves. But it's been especially hard to watch people be hurt by all the greed and all the decisions they make up in the air, and the people on the ground have to deal with the consequences of it, which is one of the main reasons why we did unionize. So um, I, I think maybe that was the first question.
Yeah, and then I was curious about doing a unionization drive at what's always been a really conservative organization. You know, I read a book about Dallas called White Metropolis, and I read probably about 100 years worth of the Dallas Morning News, and it's not been a friend of the working class, and it has not portrayed unions in a positive light, particularly on the editorial page, but that has bled over at times into the news content. And so I think that may have put you in an interesting position. And by the way, I want to clarify, I think that the American public tends to think of the working class as people working in factories. But I think one of the things the pandemic illustrated is how similar most of Americans' lives are. Our lives are really controlled to a very large degree by other people, and including decisions that affect our safety and our health. But anyway, so you're in this organization with this history, with its relationship to the labor movement, very anti-labor on the editorial page. What was that like? And what was the response of management, which are some very rich, old, powerful men in Dallas?
Oh, Dr. Phillips. First of all, I read your book. I don't know if you know that, because
Oh,
I, by the way, have always wanted to know, like, what's the real scoop with Dallas? Like, because we're not it. Like, the Dallas Morning News can cover the first draft of history of what's happening right now, but I wanted to know, like, the things that are happening in our city are contextualized and are systemic, and they had to come somewhere, and people in power had to maintain it somehow. And so your book, where you talk about how there's like this erasure, this need to like forget the past and for the sake of like business and everything, I was like, that he hit it. That is exactly right. Because nothing can get in the way of making money, it seems like, right? Like,
thank
even,
you for being my book agent, but go ahead.
I'm a closet nerd also. Like, I just love to read what seems like dense,
Yeah.
literature reviews of stuff. So to get to your question, um, Dallas, Dallas Morning News, actually, one of the writers coined the term the right to work state. So we're the paper that coined the term. So I've been told, if you prove me wrong, then that'll be really great, because I like it when that happens too. So we already have this history where we're in a state that is like deeply against any worker having their own rights and say, right? Because they don't know any better, right? And we're at a company that the management always has a plan that they don't tell the workers about until it happens, right? So there's a history of that. Um, and I think what's really interesting is that we have the challenges. I think your question was like, this was a radical change, right? Um, the thing is that the paper, there was always change that seemed, when your coworkers are laid off, that's a radical change, right? When your pay is cut, that's a radical change in your life, right? So the normal day-to-day, like, doing business for people in management, is radical change for workers on a very fundamental material level. So unionizing was our way to have a voice in what that change looked like, because we needed to stem the tide of hemorrhaging from our newsrooms. The lack of investment in newsrooms was very distressing, is very distressing to us. So the challenge is that was really tough. Speaking to your anti-union, like the rhetoric behind it, when you're organizing, you go through inoculation, and you hear what management's going to say. And we were actually found out, right? So someone in management, like, they leaked whatever they found out, and so, like, we had a staff meeting, and they're like, we heard that there's talks of unionizing, and you shouldn't do it. It would be bad. And, like, they gave us all the reasons, like, it's going to cost time, it's going to cost money. we're not going to be flexible. And we had a bingo card where we could like all the anti-union playbook, I can't cuss here, can I? Crap that they would throw at us. We were like, okay, yeah, bingo. This was a quick game because it really was straight from the playbook. But what was, I think, particularly challenging that for us was that they used emotional manipulation with like editors who had good relationships with their workers, because we do here, we have a great set of editors. We have great people on our team. And they were not afraid to pull every single tactic that they had in the playbook. And we had some very tense meetings with management, all like captive audience meetings where the whole newsroom was there. We had one with Robert Deckard, and he's our owner. And it was very hard to sit in those meetings as a worker, because here's what's really crazy. We both want to preserve local journalism in North Texas. We want it to be strong, and we want it to be vibrant and robust, and all that, right? But we also want to be paid a fair wage, a full wage. We also want to have good health care. We also want to have pay equity, all those things. So it was really hard because we felt like during the whole anti-union campaign, the whole reason we unionized was because we felt like management wasn't listening to us when we would tell them that things are not okay, and the workers on the ground had solutions, and we would bring them to management, and they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll do a study, we'll have a committee, we'll do a report, and nothing would happen. There was no action behind it. And not to say that they didn't try, right? And so that's kind of, the challenge is that we actually do have similar goals, but their goal of survival and profitability comes at the expense of us. And that's where obviously we were like, we can't do this anymore. So.
Okay. All right. Very good. And I think you covered some of the issues that the workers have dealt with in the past year. So thank you very much. I'm going to want to bring in Stacy Gray. If we can highlight her, put her on the speaker platform there. And Stacy, you were on the panel a couple of years ago, I believe. And you were basically in a very early stage of starting the effort to unionize, and you just recently won that victory. Now, you work at Book People in Austin. I want you to tell me what the conditions that led to this unionization drive, and then how you won the victory, because these aren't easy things to accomplish.
No, yeah, Leah mentioned the right to work. I've heard it called in union circles, right to work for less, which I think is far more accurate. Brief history on Book People for anyone who doesn't know. Book People we're celebrating our 50th year in business. It is the largest independent bookstore in Texas, and one of the top 5 independent bookstores in the United States. And let's see. So Book People had a long history of a lot of the things that I was hearing Leah say, basically just workers not getting paid well. The starting pay at Book People was really deplorable for many years, and even worse, people didn't make consistent raises. So there were people working there, 10, 15 plus years, making the same or maybe a quarter more than people who had just started. And for many years, the line was, well, we don't have the money to pay you all more. This is all we can pay you. And it was believed for a while, for a decent while too, because it was true for a long time. Independent bookstores in general, have a very large margin. There's not a huge room for profit because the amount that we can sell the book for is printed on the book, so we can't upsell things. So that was true for a very long time. However, in the past 15 or so years, things started to take a turn, and book people started becoming very, very successful. And every year was beating its previous goals, its previous profits by large margins over and over again. And in past years, people have tried to bring about change and even talk unionizing and things like that, and it was always squashed very quickly. About almost 3 years ago now, in July of 2018, I would say the morale at the store was at an all-time low. We had just lost a manager, a good friend of mine, who had taken his own life. We were, it was the lowest point I've ever seen the store in my 22 years off and on there. And just a few days after we lost our friend, I got some information, and it was just kind of one of those random things that somebody found out some information and thought I would like to know. And that information was how much one of the higher ups at Book People, was making at the time. And it lit a fire. It lit a fire inside of me right then and there. And I took that piece of information and told another person, and saw the firelight in his eyes, and spoke with a few other people and asked them if they would come over and to my house and start trying to figure it out. And so in July of 2018, at the picnic table on my porch, we sat down and started hashing it out. And we did research. We quickly brought in a couple of people from our local DSA and started getting their advice and support. And it became very obvious very quickly that unionizing was our best option, because it would put the law on our side.
By the way, if I could ask, when you, if you could just explain what DSA stands for, because not everyone may understand that.
Sure. Yeah, the DSA is the Democratic Socialists of America, and they have a very active chapter here in Austin, of which Sarah is a part of, and some other wonderful people that helped put us in contact with people at the AFL-CIO, and they also put us in contact with a few different unions, and one of those unions was OPEIU, and they are the office.
Yeah, go ahead.
I gotta see if I can get it right, because I always forget what it stands for. The Office of Professional Employees, PEI, an industry. Oh, I can't remember all of it. I'll have to look it up and get it for you before I finish, because I always do this. Somebody asked me what the acronym stands for, and I'm like, because it, of course, there's no, as you noticed, there's no booksellers, there's no bookstores in there, which is a point that I made yesterday on the AFL-CIO's labor at Live at 5 broadcast, that you don't have to join a union that represents your particular job. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Oh, thank you. Sarah helped me. The Office of Professional Employees International. Hold on, I got to get to the chat. Union. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is correct. The Office of Professional Employee International in Union. I believe that is right. Thank you, Sarah. So we started that process in July of 2018. We kind of did this crazy, quick, and very organized, quick drive, and were able to hold our vote to unionize in November of that same year. So just a few months later, which was kind of unheard of, but we were highly motivated, and there were just some other things involved that were making us feel like we needed to get that part of the process done as quickly as possible. And it was good too, because if we'd given them more time, we might not have gotten the votes. We went into that vote thinking we had it locked in, no problem, and it was much closer than we thought it was going to be, because they had definitely done their work and done some union busting. But we got it, and we started building our contract at that point, and we would have been through with our contract in March of 2020. However, something happened, a little pandemic happened, and kind of put it all on hold, but we were able to virtually finish the contract and put all the finishing touches on it. And of January 24th of last month of this year, January 21st, 2021, we unanimously voted yes to ratify our very first collective bargaining agreement. During that process, I will say that as soon as we got those votes and got our union, so many things changed for us. The overall attitude of the store changed. Part of that came with a new CEO coming in, and she is our new CEO, Charlie Razik, is just amazing and supportive, and her jumping in at just the right time and jumping on board with our idea of working in an independent bookstore is not just a stopgap or a quick, college job, or it can be a career. And so now we actually feel like we're in a viable career working at a bookstore, and we got our wages raised. We got all the things pretty much that we wanted in our contract, minus a couple of things that we ended up having to take out just because they were unsure of how we'd come out on the other side of the pandemic. And so basically our contract went from a 3-year contract to a 1-year contract, just so we could kind of, what we were saying is it allows us to test drive this contract for a year and see how it works. And then we'll have to go back in and renegotiate things that we want and move forward. But yeah, it was definitely a long process. I describe it on a regular basis as campaigning, organizing a campaign to unionize is like a marathon. But every once in a while, you have 100-yard sprint or 100-yard hurdle or 100-yard some sort of obstacle course that you have to quickly kick it up a notch and get through. But it's worth it. And if it can take a store from the lowest morale point that I could possibly imagine a retail store being, to being a supportive, functioning, efficient environment, it's so worth the time and the effort.
Okay. So excellent. And there's so many, even without a pandemic and with the danger of businesses closing, you always have all the people who want jobs outside. That can be used as pressure against people who are trying to unionize, and that's always a dynamic in the labor movement. So I want to bring in another couple of panelists, Stephanie and Tavita, and if we could go maybe to panel view, so we can bring both of them, or I guess it'll switch back as people speak, right? Yeah, they'll appear on the screen as they speak. So yeah, so Tavita and Stephanie, I remember really at the beginning of the pandemic, the airline industry seemed to have been really walloped, and it seems like the management of these airline companies always are in a state of financial crisis. It seems like the industry is always about to collapse. Even the fewer airlines there are, it doesn't matter. They still always seem to be on the verge of collapse, or at least that's what they say. And you had to deal with so many people weren't flying. For a while, people weren't flying. And so that was a crisis. And then on top of that, flight crews had to deal with belligerent passengers who refused to wear masks, other forms of abuse from customers, and then pressure from management. So I'm curious. Your view of what airline workers went through in the past year, and any unique issues I haven't brought up that workers in the airline industry have faced since March of 2020. So either one of you want to start, Stephanie or Rita?
I'll start. Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for inviting me to be a guest panelist again this year. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Collin College students. As far as the pandemic is concerned, the last year, from our work group, which we represent the mechanics and the fleet service clerks of American Airlines. Transport Workers Union Local 513 is the largest union here in American Airlines. We have been, the pandemic has been really bad on our workforce. We're averaging 18 to 25 sick or positive case members who are getting sick every day. On January 8th, the Dallas Morning News released an article about our issues with American Airlines and how they're running their operation here on the ground. As far as above wing, they've made strides to kind of build back the confidence in the flying public again. They're starting to make sure that people are wearing masks on planes, in the lounge areas, anywhere we can, anywhere their passengers are in. And we also have a federal mask mandate, which was an executive order, which was passed on February 1st by the Biden administration. That's why I'm wearing my mask outside, because anytime you're caught out here without a mask from any airport authority or airport police, constitutes a fine, and we could also be disciplined from American Airlines. But our operation is still suffering. The way American Airlines runs their hubs is they move groups of people from gate to gate, which creates more touch points and more interaction between other co-workers. So we are really just running around in circles around each other, further spreading the potential to get the COVID virus. So that is what we're dealing with at the moment. As far as anything else going on in the airline industry, you know that we've been very, very upfront, and it's been a personal task for the airline industry unions to get COVID relief packages passed for our members, both union and non-union workers in the airline industry, where we can keep people on the clock through payroll support programs and continue to have these people on their insurance if they have company provided insurance. So that is what's going on with American Airlines here today. And Stephanie will give you a better in-depth answer on what's going on with Unite here and our catering workers.
Hi everyone. Thanks again to Dr. Michael Phillips to have invited me to this panel again for a second time. Last year was a very hard year, especially for us working straight to the front line. That's how I call it. Like Tavida has said, it has been very hard. For a catering worker, it has been even more harder because the fly are not going out, so we have actually nothing to do. We have seen since March, 70% of our workers been laid off. And being laid off means you don't have health insurance. Even if you catch a sickness, there's no way for you to get a treatment. You're at home, maybe living on unemployment like most of our people have done since March. And we have some of our people call back on August and get laid off again on September because they have received the CARE Act money, who was going to end on September 30th. So after September 30th, they lay everybody off again. So just to tell you how hard it is to deal with the catering worker. And talking about safety, it's not very easy. We don't really deal with customer. We just deal in between us. But even at that, it was not something very easy. I know two of my coworkers who have passed away from the COVID. That COVID is not a joke. It's something very serious. And we see ourselves very return into little things, coming at that point, we were not really doing absolutely nothing for the airline because there was no flight going out. Travella can talk better about that. Like he said already, there was actually no flight going out because due to the COVID. So we didn't really have work to do. So we were all laid off, and that was very, very crazy.
It must be. Uh, I know for a lot of workers, there was a sense of dread, when you see a text or a phone call about someone else passing away that you worked with. This was a common experience, I think, for a lot of workers this year. Their family, their working family, dealing with that. So let me bring in Steve and Chad. And I want to talk about a different category of workers, so called gig workers, who make up 43% of the American workforce. And 57% of those workers work more than 40 hours a week. And in spite of the fact they work longer, they earn 58% less than full time workers. It's very hard to organize, to recruit into unions workers who are classified as independent contractors, and when they do opt to join, I already mentioned what happened in industry in my introduction, where Instacart laid off those workers and then started slashing the numbers classified as employees. So I'm wondering, this reality of the growing number of gig workers, everyone's an independent contractor. What challenge does this reality pose to the labor movement? And what does that say about the status of workers today compared to the past? Chad can talk about going back to the Gilded Age, but what you've seen, Steve, since you've been working, and been in the labor movement. What is it? How has this affected the overall quality of life for workers in America?
Well, so let's start with the first thing. It's been coined as the gig economy, but let's call it what it is. It's a workers on demand market. One of the first things that we need to do is actually affirm that working people in the gig economy all share a single common designation, which is that they are employees, regardless of what we call them, whether they're contract employees, independent contractors, gig workers. Every single one of them are in fact an employee. And it's a very important distinction that we should recognize, and we should ensure that all workers are classified properly. That is the purpose of the AFL-CIO, is to fight misclassification, because that designation is because the operational definition behind employee currently does not include them in the on-demand market by design. It's a loophole. It's been taken advantage of, and it's been used by companies to bypass regulations, to pass along the responsibilities and the liabilities that come along with those regulations, and the worker protections that are afforded all employees in the U.S. under the National Labor Relations Act. That things like minimum wage, overtime, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, family and medical leave. As a byproduct of misclassification, all of those costs for those programs and participation and eligibility for those programs is then absorbed by the worker. So they give them a little bit more money, but it does not cover the expenses of those items. When they choose to participate, because at that point, as an independent contractor, it is up to them to participate, and they can choose to simply not pay into Social Security, which would then be at their detriment upon retirement. What it does effectively, if it leaves that employee in a vulnerable position in regard to their long-term health, their long-term wages and retirement, as well as all of their tax liabilities. Because again, as an employer, being classified as an employer as a 1099 employee, they are actually subject to both paying that Social Security tax that gets taken out of your paycheck, plus also matching it as a self-employer. Unions and the AFL-CIO have long been fighting back against the employers who misclassify working people and also create vulnerable workplace situations. That's what we've always done. That is the entire point of what the AFL-CIO is committed to ensure that any new form of employer manipulation, like worker misclassifications, do not continue to erode the rights of working people in the U.S. You can rest
By the
assured.
way, I was just going to add, there are all kinds of liabilities those workers bear on their own. So, like Lyft and Uber drivers, for instance, they're not quote unquote employees, and so any expenses related to an accident that might occur is borne by the worker. Am I correct on that?
That is correct. I've even gone so far as when I was in an apprenticeship, I needed to have a second job. I had 3 children. I was a single parent. And so I picked up a side gig, being a contract employee delivering new prescriptions to nursing homes. And so I had to change my insurance on my vehicle to include that extra insurance that's required for Department of Transportation for transporting pharmaceuticals. That was something that was not reimbursed, and I just had to absorb it. And I was still only getting, $12 an hour, or in some cases just by delivery. So with that being the case, yes, there's a ton of financial liabilities that get placed onto the employee or the gig worker instead of the actual contractor who's paying out the money. So with that being said, I mean, we can rest assured, we've seen it now. You threw out the stats when we started this call, or this portion of the call, that it has proliferated. And that if the employers continue to get away with pretending their workers are not in fact employees, the practice is going to continue to propagate itself. It is going to move and infect other workspaces. And if you look around today, like myself, I've been around a while, obviously I'm a little bit of a graybeard. You have to ask yourself, how many of the people that you work with today are actually contract workers now versus when you started in that industry? And I can guarantee you the number of people that sit around you has gone up. So I wanted to read something really quickly from Secretary Treasurer Liz Schuler of the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO is committed to working with our allies, our business communities, and our community partners to enact policies that would prevent gig economy workers from falling through the cracks. If we act now, we can build a future of work that promises working people a better life. And I wanted to add that our goal in the labor movement is to preserve and expand workers' rights by making it mandatory for all workers, not just accessible to some. This is not going to be realized by fighting against the on-demand market. It's here. It's probably going to stay. But it will be realized by expanding the very definition of the employee to include on-demand employees as it should.
It's interesting that that proposition passed in California, which was incredibly damaging to the working class because of the reputation of California in the modern era as being, progressive and liberal. But of course, the propositions are funded by big corporations typically, and it involves what's called astroturf organizing. They hire people to get on the ballot, and then few people pay attention and few people vote on those measures. And the California ballot, by the way, is like a Dostoevsky novel. It's hundreds of pages if you voted in California, like I did. Chad, could you put this in some historical perspective? This movement towards gig workers and the status of workers in 2021, over the long term, in American history?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about, looking around today, we've got workers from all sorts of different industries. And when you talk to a lot of folks, traditionally, you say unions, they might think of, factory workers exclusively, but we're, actors, actresses, pilots, we've got food service workers, and of course, gig workers, right? And so in all of these cases, the bottom line is that, folks feel exploited. They look around, they realize that the problem is not an individual problem, but is a collective problem, right? And with that in mind, they discover that it's a collective solution. I think that's always it's kind of basic stuff, but it's very important to kind of, I think, hit home that point about collectivism and the importance, the centrality of solidarity, irrespective of what kind of industry we're talking about. And to build those networks is key. I've been really inspired listening to folks, who went through these kind of struggles and had to deal with the managerial nonsense and bullying and shenanigans. But to be able to cut through that, I think is really key. Let me say something else somewhat related to this question of gig workers and Prop 22. We often think about our foes, the anti-labor foes, as being these right-wing Republican types, but the key folks behind Prop 22 are bigwig Democrats, right? We need to be honest about that. It's Seth Harris, who was a big guy in the Obama administration. He's a lawyer for Uber, wrote the legislation that behind Prop 22, and Tony West, who happens to be brother-in-law of Kamala Harris, he was the lawyer for Uber behind this, and the law itself was co-written by Seth Harris, who is a Biden advisor. So I think this makes things kind of tricky, and I don't mean to be provocative here, but I think we need to be honest about the powers behind the anti-union forces in our society, right? And to say, okay, Republicans, they're very much overt about it, but we also must be savvy and strategic about how we approach this question of Democrats and those who are in established liberal positions. Because this Proposition 22, it's a reality in California, but the architects behind it want to go further, right? They want this to become a reality in other states as well. And so how do you talk to people about that? How do you mobilize is a question.
Now, I want to talk to Sarah next. This is another group of people who often aren't seen as part of the working class. Sarah works again with the Texas State Employees Union. And of course, there's a bill being discussed right now in the state legislature. Hasn't, really, the hearings haven't happened during the session yet. That would make it more difficult for that organization to collect union dues. And in fact, that's one way that unions are often organized, is how easy is it to collect the union dues. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. And I also want to mention this fact that state employees are prohibited from collective bargaining, which is a chip off the table, that that particular union doesn't have. And then finally, I'm hoping you can explain not only these issues, but also describe some of the rights that state employees do enjoy that many don't know about, many will not be aware of.
Hello, Dr. Phillips. And yes, there is frequently a challenge to attack Texas State Employees Union and other unions for public employees in Texas, such as the teachers unions and firefighters unions, on our ability to collect dues. This has come up for a few different legislative sessions in a row at the Texas legislature, which is only in session for several months every other year. There are often bills filed that try to make it harder for us to collect our dues. So unions like ours and like the teachers unions collect dues through payroll. So the comptroller's office that processes payroll for employees also will take out dues for the union once an employee has decided to join the union, which of course every employee has to elect to join the union and fill out a form saying that they would like to pay the dues. So this has come about a few years. I believe in 2017, that was the legislative session when Greg Abbott called a special session over the summer where he focused on over a dozen priorities that legislative session. And one of them was we need to stop payroll dues deduction. We need to make it so that these unions cannot take their dues via the payroll system. so this has definitely been a big target from Republicans, from certain Republicans, some more than others. Um, and the problem with this is that for an organization like Texas State Employees Union, we have thousands of members scattered across the state at many different workplaces. Same thing with teachers unions. They have, many employees scattered across tons of different schools and school districts. If you remove the ability to collect dues from paychecks, that means that all of those thousands of members stop paying dues overnight when that goes into effect. You can still have the members, but you now have to find a new way to collect the dues from those members, which would mean signing people up via credit or debit card, or signing them up for a bank draft out of their bank account. But you got to get those debit card numbers or those bank account numbers from all of your thousands of employees, many of whom you don't have a working phone number for. So then the union is tasked with having to contact and get on the phone or send an email to every single member. And that, there's only going to be 20% that respond in a prompt manner, and the other 80%, who knows if you'll get them back or how long it might take you all year to get those people back, and a lot of them you won't. So the union will see most of its dues dry up overnight if something like that passes, which essentially, would cut the union staff in half or something like that, depending on budgets. And so that would be completely devastating to teachers unions. And there are a couple different teachers unions in Texas, the American Federation of Teachers and the Texas State Teachers Association, and a couple of associations that also represent teachers, but not as much on the labor union flavor. But all of those organizations, I believe all of them, some of them may collect the dues differently, but definitely Texas AFT takes their dues via people's paychecks, I believe. So this is like a huge thing that our union has just had to spend a whole lot of our time fighting. We've started signing people up. When new members sign up, for a long time, we just offered them to sign up via their debit card or their bank account instead of putting it through the payroll dues system, because we were worried that would go away. We eventually switched back to payroll dues, but we're constantly having to keep an eye on what's coming up. So far this session, there has not been a payroll dues deduction ban filed, luckily, but instead they're trying to go through the comptroller's office. So the comptroller can write some of their own rules. They can change the rules for their office. And it was Attorney General Ken Paxton, at the urging from a certain Republican lawmaker, that issued us an opinion, a non-binding opinion that they wrote to the comptroller's office. So they're trying to put some new hoops to jump through that would make it more difficult. It would not remove the payroll dues deduction overnight like legislation could, but it will still make it very difficult for us to collect our dues that way for newer members. So, I mean, and the problem is that even though there has been some Republican support to remove payroll dues deduction in past sessions, it ultimately hasn't passed because of Democrats opposing it and some moderate Republicans opposing it as well. And also sometimes we've just gotten lucky based on procedural stuff. But at the end of the day, the Texas House has voted against banning the payroll dues deduction. Even though it's pretty conservative, at the end of the day, the majority of the members do not support this union busting tactic. However, that does not stop certain people like the Attorney General from trying to find some other way to gum up the works for us. So that is a current thing that's going on, and there's a hearing on February 18th that the comptroller's office is having to see if they're going to go forward with these new rules that they've suggested that would make it difficult for us to collect our dues via people's payroll. So while that is that's kind of like a more technical or bureaucratic issue, it is one that would, depending if they were to pass legislation on that, it would definitely cut our union. It would remove more than half of our union's budget, like immediately, which is a huge threat. It's already very hard to organize state employees in Texas since it's a right to work state. And yes, Michael is correct about how both the teachers and state employees and some other types of public employees cannot collectively bargain in Texas. So while we do have a union, it does not have a lot of the main rights and aspects that most labor unions would have because we don't negotiate a contract. Instead, the bulk of our work is lobbying at the state legislature to get them to pass things to improve our working conditions and improve our pay, or also some issues we take directly to the state agencies that employ workers and work with the agencies to try to fix certain rules or improve workplace standards. So that's a little bit about what TSCU does. And state employees do have good pensions. Dr. Phillips mentioned, to talk about some of the benefits, and currently state employees still do have better benefits than a lot of employees in the private sector. The health insurance is pretty good. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good. And you can get it for free for one person that you don't have to, pay out of your paycheck. And pension is pretty strong. It's very similar to the pension that the teachers have. But these are things that we always have to be vigilant to protect. And currently the employee retirement system is underfunded. And we're hoping that the Texas legislature will shore up the funding for that this year. There has been some interest even from Republicans to shore up the funding. However, there are often, some Republicans in the background that will talk about privatizing the pension, making it a 401k instead, which does not serve employees as well. So, always having to watch out for those ideas. But overall, I was a Texas State Employees Union member for 2.5 years, and I recently started working at Texas State Employees Union, and I have found it, a very good organization. It has a wide variety of members across the state. The members are very active in participating in lobbying at the Capitol. We are able to bring out more members to do meetings with lawmakers than a lot of other organizations can bring. There's very few that can mobilize as many people as we can. And so that having a lot of participation from the rank and file at Texas State Employees Union has definitely been a big asset. Something that, is good for helping us win on certain issues, but it's also just good for building power amongst the working class by, getting state employees involved in the politics of Texas and helping them understand who their legislators are. So yeah, I'm very grateful for the opportunities that TSCU provided me when I was a member, when I worked at the Health and Human Services Commission, and now working there during this legislative cycle. It has been really good.
Thank you, Sarah. And Pauline, I want to bring you in. Thank you for being patient. We held you for last, and I want to ask you a question as a follow-up, because when we met the first time, a strike had occurred at General Motors in Arlington. It's now been, I guess, 2 years, or this will be and since that happened. Can you remind us of the issues that led to auto workers holding that strike? And I'm curious, and there was a settlement reached. And I'm wondering what life has been like working for GM since then, and how have the events of the last year affected GM workers?
Well, the strike was actually last year. So.
Oh, it's last year. It's late 2019, right? Late 2019, yeah.
Yeah. So it was. The things were pay raises. We have a bunch of factory transitional workers that were living in poverty wages, temporaries. We had a long-term temporaries who, they didn't have a past of permanency. They would have stayed temporary workers. They had in healthcare for us seasoned employees. They wanted to take our healthcare from us. So those were our major issues. What has happened since then? We did have the 40-day strike for seasoned employees that we didn't really gain much. We didn't. But the bigger picture was that in order for us all to be on the same playing field, in order for us to get strength, everybody had to be on the same playing field. So those transitional workers and those temporary workers were what we were really out there fighting for. We got seasonal, I've almost 21 years. Those, we basically got the same raise we got in our 2015 contract. We got the same raises that we got in 2015. And as far as the temporary and we had a two-tier system. They got paid one rate, we got paid another rate. That has been eliminated, and those people are in progression of being brought up to the wages that everyone is going to make across the board. We've had about 2,000 temporary employees get turned over to permanency, and for the next 2 years, in January, they'll be brought up as soon as they meet their 2-year working 2 consecutive years. They'll also be turned into permanent employees, so that was great for them. But although it didn't affect me directly, it does, because that gives the union more power. The way General Motors was able to turn the situations around is they turned 2 tiers against the regular traditional employees. And so we're fighting each other about something that we don't control, because we don't pay them. General Motors pays them, but they don't, they turn that into, this tier to that tier, which really was a GM thing. It's not a union thing, because the unions don't have tiers. As union members, every union member pays their 2 months salary or 2 hours salary once a month. It has nothing to do with how you're treated. It's just what you pay into the union. You pay your equal share. But they turned it into, being a 2-tier person. A lot of them didn't understand. They thought it was a union thing. It's really not. That's just the company's decision. And the union agreed, because if not, a whole lot more of us would have lost our jobs. So in order to keep the company open, people that came in at a later date got a different wage. But the plan was to eliminate that, anyway. But with the UAW scandal, a lot of that came into play, and it just really, like I said, we didn't get a lot of major wins. We did get raises, again, like we had 2015. They did take the cap off our profit sharing, which was at 12,000 was the max you can get for profit sharing. That has also been removed. Ton of factories have gotten $1 billion investments. Even GM Arlington, where I work, we got like $1.4 billion investments to keep us rolling into the future. General Motors is now rolling into doing electric vehicles and building batteries. One of the biggest takeaways that we didn't get, that we really, really wanted, was for our Ohio plant to stay open. Even, a lot of those people voted for Trump. And so, at the end, even he was invested in keeping that plant open, but General Motors would not budge. They would not budge. They did shut that plant down, and they're going to open up a battery plant to build electric batteries down the street. But of course, those people, again, will get lower wages. They're not going to be on that same tier. So collective bargaining and union, like they were talking about, they don't have it's hard even when you have a collective bargaining agreement, because there's so many different variables as to how the company is winning nowadays with the economy. And then you got a National Labor Relations Board that's basically anti-union because of Trump. You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot that plays into what we get. We are doing better than most, but we're having hard times too. And so since COVID has also caused, we came off a strike for 40 days. People were getting evicted and thrown out of their house and on assistance. They come to work for less than a month because our plant was shut down due to the new product. So you got people coming in, and then you got, the union trying to fight for them to get back to work. And then we got COVID. And you got people dying, people getting sick. I will say General Motors has done a good job at our facility in making sure that people are safe. You can't social distance, but they are sanitizing and things like that. So the union has made General Motors come up with a plan, and they have effectively stuck with that plan.
Very good. I think you really brought up, Pauline, a lot of issues that really lead us to our last question. And this is for everyone. I think that all of us will agree that the past, starting with Donald Trump's escalator ride down to Trump Tower to announce his race for the presidency to today have been consequential. So I want you to discuss the immediate past, what I think will be called the Trump era, because it was one of those presidencies. What that meant for the labor movement, and then to pick up on something Chad meant, how should we respond to the beginning of the Biden era? And I'll mention something just at the start. One issue is, there's been a fight for the 15 for a very long time. Sarah was involved in that. There's a bill in the Senate that will finally implement a $15 minimum wage 4 years from now. And, of course, that's $31,000 a year, $32,000 a year, which is not much now. And I'm not sure what it's going to be in 2024, 2025. So I would like you guys to talk about what the impact of the recently concluded presidential term, what that has meant for the working class and for the labor movement, and then also what you expect, what you hope for, what you worry about in the next 4 years.
I can say for me, the fact that he immediately got rid of General Counsel on the National Labor Relations Board and his deputy, he said he was going to be the most pro-union president that we've ever had, and he's coming out guns blazing. Now, is he going to be perfect? Is everything they're going to be perfect? Absolutely not. Nobody should expect to have everything, but the big picture is they are on our side, and they have definitely proven that. And I may not win everything that I want, but I definitely appreciate, the fact that they understand labor and they are on the side of labor, and they've shown that. Are we going to definitely have to pay attention? Yes, we are. But so far, so good for me.
Anyone else?
I was just going to say that as far as the recent history for us in the bargaining room when we were building our very first contract from scratch, I can't tell you how many times we'd come across something and Tyler, the president of OPIU Local 277 there in the Dallas area, would say, well, we just don't know because we don't know what the Trump administration is going to do. And so there were just so many unknowns and so many worries for what that administration could have done on top of all the things that it did do. And as far as looking forward, I, for one, definitely have a lot more hope in this administration and with the people that Biden is putting into power, mostly just for the fact that I feel like for the very first time in the history of our nation, our government at least slightly more closely resembles our nation. There are more women, and we have, members of the LGBTQ plus, transgender and gay people, and the fact that there are so many firsts that happened in this last election as far as people being elected, that brings me more hope almost than anything else. Just the people that I know that are there, that are fighting, and the youth that is coming along. And also, just on a very, very personal note, my 13-year-old son is a staunch socialist. So I'm at least helping to raise the next generation of labor fighters and organizers, hopefully.
Who else? Chad, you had your hand raised?
Yes, thank you. No doubt Trump was anti-labor in a whole host of ways, but we have to remember, I think, and that is that politicians are not our friends and we have to pressure them. Just to give you a sense, we have Democrats going back to Carter, Clinton, and Obama, all of whom talked about labor reform, improving, making it easier for workers to organize, et cetera, and that did not come to fruition. Union density declined faster under Obama than it did under baby Bush. Obama talked about the Employee Free Choice Act. He talked about, he's going to walk picket lines. Meanwhile, you have more right to work states under Obama. And so this is not to say that, Trump's better. Certainly he is not, but we need to be honest and sober about the political landscape. And it always goes back to the people, I think. It always goes back to organizing. When you have a choice about lobbying politicians or building solidarity with fellow workers, it shouldn't be an either or, of course, but it's building at the grassroots that's critical. Continue to pressure the politicians. They'll often do good things. Biden has said some good things, but he also has a record that is far from perfect. So not to be a Debbie Downer, but I think we need to be sober about this stuff.
So Leah, you were the enemy of the people in the last administration as a journalist, right?
Yes, you could say that.
I mean, that's what the the last president called the.
Yeah, yes. That was the thing. I'm not. Yeah, you probably can guess how I feel. I'm not going to get into that. My point is actually having to do with what Chad was saying. Every time something happens and we're like, okay, we're going to need to file an unfair labor practice because they broke status quo, or like our gut instinct is to like turn to the law, which by the way is like really not great actually, and isn't where our power comes from, right? It comes from your workers standing together, trusting each other, taking action together. And this is the kind of mentality I think we should take, because I mean, Chad's right. First of all, as journalists, like we don't trust any politician. Like our job isn't to like be like, yay, like we have Biden now, things are going to be great. Like they're never great. There are too many structural things that are deeply ingrained in the way that our world works and operates through power and money, that the only thing that you can do is remember that if the boss doesn't show up to work, the work gets done, right? If the workers don't show up to work, the work doesn't get done. You have to remember that, because otherwise, like, your power doesn't come from the labor board deciding because it's a Biden board that it's going to give you everything. That's what we have to remind our people. And I think when you can transform people's minds and make them see that it's them, they have the power to do incredible things. Man, we can sweep the South. Let's do it. Like, we can do it. So I think that's really exciting, and that's what I'm excited about. But also having like human beings with a passing intelligence of an adult in a position of power who makes decisions about these. Yes, absolutely excited about that. Yeah.
So Steve and Tavita and Stephanie, Sarah, all four of you, are you hopeful, cautious, relieved? Do you feel like what is your mood about the next 4 years and the prospects for workers in the country?
Well, so I'm going to jump in real quick because, to be honest with you, I'm running low on battery. I'm sitting here in Georgia, out in the sticks, and finding it really, really interesting to be working on the other side of it as a traveler in the building trades. It is a completely different realm of work. And that being said, over the last couple of months, especially during the Senate races that happened over here, that's one of the reasons I got to actually participate in that. Placing AFL-CIO signs all over the county, that was a lot of fun. But when I look at, there is no secret behind the fact that I was a Bernie fan from the start. And the reason for that is because when I go with the saying I use everywhere is that a person's past behavior is indicative of future expectations or behavior. The truth of the matter is that Bernie is somebody that was always with labor. You go back as far as you can and you see he stood with us throughout thick and thin, never once ran away from those issues. And then you look at Biden or Trump, and Trump was actively pursuing the degradation of the power or the remaining power of the unions, whether that was in the public sector, where he sought to remove the dues checkoff, the placement of Peter Robb that Pauline alluded to a minute ago, who actively campaigned to destroy the power of the NLRB by removing the I guess the jurisdictional authorities from the regional offices and trying to consolidate that from purposely not backfilling empty positions after he got rid of them. Which actually an act that Congress considers hostile. Not using the funds that are allocated to you is just as bad as overspending. And when you see Biden come in, it did give me a glimmer of hope that we could do what Chad said, which is still pressure a new team. The stark differences between the two administrations boils down to one word, and it's called empathy. You had the Trump administration who was out to gut every single thing they could for profit at the expense of the people because they don't empathize with the working class. Whereas Biden, on the other hand, coming in, fired Peter Robb because of the power grabs and his just incessant, he just got stuck on the fact that regional directors and the NLRB should not be protecting workers, whether that meant a situation like McDonald's where he intervened, overriding the judicial authority of that case, and convinced the individual persons to settle out of court when they found at the NLRB had already found that there was joint responsibility between the franchisee and McDonald's Corporation as a whole when they were suing them, and named both in the case. And we saw it repeatedly. So the idea that Biden came in swinging and actually got rid of that, I see hope. But when I see things like the PRO Act still sitting on that desk and not being passed, which would actually make the largest changes to union labor law in the U.S. since the original NLRA was actually written into law, that would be tremendous to see. But I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious at the same time. So I'm glad you said that.
So Steve, real quickly, National NLRB is the National Labor Relations Board, and you mentioned the PRO Act. Could you explain to people watching what that is?
Yes. So the PRO Act is the Protect the Right to Organize Act. That was written and passed by Congress back in May of last year. The point of that entire legislation is to put teeth behind the existing labor laws that are out there. In almost 40% of the new organizing cases that we try to go out and organize new workers, we see situations like you see in Amazon right now. I think that's in Alabama that they're having that vote for it right now to form a union, and they're actively targeting all of the employees who are helping to organize that. They're actively pushing an anti-union message out there, which are actually against the law to do, but the NLRB is not stepping in play and enforcing those rules. So the fact that happens on 40% of the organizing drives is a big issue. Okay. And the PRO Act would actually put teeth behind that with bigger financial penalties to make it no longer a beneficial cost that you can just live with, but actually make it so cost prohibitive that any corporation would look at that and say, wow, if I get targeted and I have to pay a fine for every single employee whose rights I violated at 25, 50,000, 100,000, let me just not do that because it would cost me more in litigation expenses and in settlements than to just let the people have their vote and do what they're going to do, because they're either going to choose to be part of a union or they're not, and actually grant the people the right to choose.
All right, Tavita, Sarah, and Stephanie, if you could give me a quick take on how you feel at this moment that we've had a historic transition in administrations. What do you see as the future for the workers and the labor movement?
Oh, I don't know. I'll go first.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. With this administration, we don't, like Chad said, we don't really trust politicians. What we have to do, we have to put pressure on them, like we always do. Even with the Trump administration, there's some stuff that we were able to pass, like 6 days. were able to pass that during Trump administration in Austin. Were able to pass that. That was a push. We have to do all the rally, spend the days work knocking on doors and doing all that, and still compare with me. We have passed on this last November in the U.S. How do you call it? The overtime law. We have passed all that under Trump administration. I think with the politics, it's just we workers have to push. That they will never sit down and do some great. They will sit down and talk everything good, but they will never do it if we don't push. With the Biden administration, true, within his 100 days or his 10 days or 12 days he have done to the office, he already talked a lot of good thing about the labor. That's true, but we need to push for that to happen, just like we did with the Trump administration. Trump was bad, I would say that way, but there's a lot of stuff we are able to pass on that Trump administration. Like Stu just said, we passed with 73% of the popular vote. That was a huge thing, you know. The only thing is we workers have to push.
Okay. And
no matter what the administration is.
Yeah.
I'll quickly go.
Yeah.
From a transportation industry standpoint, we're hopeful. This mask mandate that was effective yesterday was an executive order that was signed by President Biden. It was an issue with our crews above wing where we were having, there was no teeth to the mask mandates from the airline. So basically people were deciding to wear them or not. It was not until the insurrection was when there was a really big push to get something done for a mask mandate in trains, buses, and airports. So with that, we're just hopeful in the airline industry.
And then, Sarah, I think you're going to have the next to last word here.
Yeah. I would just echo what most other people have said. Very cautiously optimistic with this new administration. And, if there's a chance that we could get the PRO Act passed, that would just be a huge change, or change so much of the landscape for organizing, especially in the South. Such a dramatic change, that we would end right to work. So I'm curious to see how that stuff shapes up and if it looks like there's a real shot at passing the PRO Act.
So this was a big panel, but labor is a big movement. And one thing I love about this panel is it looks like the country. And that's one advantage that labor has always had, is its numbers and its diversity. And so I want to thank everyone for participating, sharing your stories, your input. And we hopefully will be doing this again at next year's Texas Center for Working Class Studies annual conference. Congratulations on the two union organizers for your successful labor this coming year. Please appreciate people who deliver food to you, groceries to you. Treat them with decency. Thank you. Good evening.